From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Nathan Hendricks will share the findings from his new study, which looked at USDA crop program subsidies and how they factor into farmland rental payments. He specifically was interested in the extent to which landlords gain from those subsidies compared to tenants. Then K-State's Gretchen Sassenrath will talk about the importance of adjusting the combine ahead of corn harvest to avoid grain losses in the field. She goes over a simple method of measuring those losses and talks about minimizing those to save grain and to prevent volunteer corn from turning up in the field later on. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Jared Hoyle talks about getting ready to renovate a drought-stressed fescue lawn. Here on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network, and welcome once more to Agriculture Today. We've been noting all along the past several broadcasts that the annual Risk and Profit Conference at Kansas State University was taking place this week. In fact, it'll be underway in just a couple of hours here on the campus. One of the featured breakout sessions during Risk and Profit is in the spotlight as we open up today's broadcast. The session will look at how much do landlords benefit from agricultural subsidies versus their tenants. And this was a rather involved study, and its author is with us now, Nathan Hendricks, who is an agricultural economist at Kansas State University. Nathan, welcome back, and to give us an idea of what motivated you to look at this question of government program subsidies and how they affect tenants and landlords.
Yeah, so a question that often comes up in policy discussions is who benefits from agricultural subsidies? And one of the claims that's often been made is that, well, even if these payments are made to tenants, how much do the landlords actually benefit? Now, certainly a majority of land in Kansas is owned by the operator, but it's also true that about 44% of cropland in Kansas is owned by a non-operator landlord. So there's an important question of how much those non-operator landlords may be capturing some of the benefits, important for some of the policy discussions.
Very relevant in that sense. And so getting at that question would seem to be, on the surface, somewhat direct, but it's not an easy thing to solve, you say.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question to look at, and the reason for that is if you just look at agricultural subsidies in the United States and you look at counties that receive higher subsidies, you can see that, well, they get higher cash rental rates. But that doesn't necessarily mean those higher subsidies are causing higher cash rental rates because right, Iowa gets higher subsidy payments, but that's because the land's more productive. And so their rental rates are higher, but it's hard to know, is that because of the subsidies or is that just because of the productivity of land? So sorting out how much is due to subsidies is a pretty complicated question.
So how did you parse that out as you went about this?
Yeah, so the approach that I take is to look at the difference in subsidies for southern crops. And my argument is that those crops that were historically planted in the South, cotton, rice, and peanuts, were politically favored and that they received relatively larger direct payments. And so in this study, I'm going back and I'm looking at the direct payment program that was in place from 2002 to 2014. And if you look in the South, for the same, if you estimate the market returns from producing their crops, that in these counties where they had base acres in the southern crops of cotton, rice, or peanuts, their direct payments are substantially larger than in counties that had base acres in wheat and corn and soybeans for the same market returns.
Just as a brief footnote, you talk about the traditional southern crops because the subsidies for those crops were in place at the outset of modern-day farm policy, right?
Yeah, so if you look at one important question is why southern crops might have received higher subsidy payments. And so part of this is to go back and look at the history of farm programs. If you go back, the first major farm program was the Agricultural Adjustment Act in 1933. And at the time, the chairman of the House and Senate Ag Committees was from a southern state. And it's amazing how much that persisted up until 1995. For all but 10 years, the chairman of the House Ag Committee was from a southern state up till 1995. And for all but 12 years, the chairman of the Senate Ag Committee was from a southern state. It certainly changed after 1995, but for all those early years of developing these farm programs, the South had a really major influence. And so I'd argue these programs were favorable towards the South. And then once they're already established being favorable to the South, it's hard to get rid of that, right? Even if they don't necessarily have as much political influence today, those higher subsidies, I would argue, have continued to persist into current programs.
Well, that's the reality. Even though the South's clout might have diminished some, there's still this epic battle between the Corn Belt and the Southern Cotton Belt, if you will, on the subsidy question that exists to this day, Nathan.
That's right. We consistently see that in about every farm bill that comes up. So that's what I'm exploiting, is saying, okay, arguing that these crops were politically favored, and so saying, okay, can we compare counties that had these southern crop base acres with similar market returns to counties like in Kansas that had corn and wheat base acres, and then compare how much different were the direct payments and how much different were the cash rental rates?
So you made that comparison then and tried to figure out that relationship. What did you find?
Yeah, so on average, it's about 80 cents of every dollar of direct payments goes into cash rental rates is my final estimate. And it is what you see is that direct payments are much larger in the South for the same market returns. And you do also see that these cash rental rates are higher also in these southern counties. But if you compare those and you just do that difference, what you'll end up with is an estimate about 80 cents of every dollar of direct payments went into cash rental rates.
Was that a figure that struck you as a high figure, or how did you interpret that then?
Well, there's kind of two different camps in the argument. One is the traditional economists have usually argued that these direct payments would be fully reflected in cash rental rates. And that's what basic economic principles would predict. Basically, this would all get captured into cash rental rates. So a dollar of direct payments would be another dollar of cash rental rates. But actually, a lot of the literature within agricultural economics that has estimated this has found less than 50 cents. So my number is a bit larger than some of the other literature, but is on par with what economists would have traditionally thought.
Point is that direct payments are a substantial part of the rental payment structure as we look at cash rental rates out there. But we have other kinds of agricultural subsidies. The ARC and PLC programs are in place now. And were you able to bring those into this equation at all?
Yeah, no, I wasn't able to bring in ARC and PLC, but I think looking at direct payments has some important implications for ARC and PLC. So one, we would expect that the impact of ARC and PLC is similar to direct payments in the sense that ARC and PLC are paid on base acres. And so they're completely tied to the land. They're not based on how much the farmer actually produces or what crops are planted. And so they're similar to direct payments in that sense. So in that sense, I think that my estimate is similar to what the impact of ARC and PLC are going to be. But on the other hand, ARC and PLC do have this feature that they differ between years. And so direct payments, farmers knew exactly what that was going to be every year. It was the same every year. So it was easier to make a cash rental rate based on what that direct payment was. A little more difficult with ARC and PLC because it differs between years. And we could expect that, certainly if I were to guess which way it would go for ARC and PLC, probably there's less impact of ARC and PLC payments on cash rental rates.
But nonetheless, an impact.
Yeah, that's right. It does look like there's a substantial impact on cash rental rates.
And one of the main conclusions here is that if subsidies were removed, be it direct payments, be it ARC or PLC, that will pull back rental rates, basically.
Yeah, that's right. And we would expect then also it would have an impact on land values. Rental rates are going to have a major impact on land values. So, right, if these subsidy programs were pulled back substantially, we'd expect rental rates would go down, land values are going to go down. And really, if you think about who's going to lose the most in that case, the person who really probably loses the most is a person who just bought land. So a person who just bought land is, especially young farmers getting into the land market, when they're buying the land, part of the expectation when they're paying for that land is there's this stream of expected government payments that they're expecting to receive. And so they paid probably a higher price because those government payments were expected in the future. And if you take those out, then all of a sudden their land value drops, even though what they bid on the land was expecting those payments. So those people that really just bought the land are the ones that stand the most to lose.
So it could be a double whammy. Not only would they lose value in their land, their investment in that property, but they would also be losing the government payments. So the revenue stream would be less as well.
That's right. We're basically buying the land with an expectation of these government payments, and then if they're making a loan payment on that, but now all of a sudden they're losing part of that stream of benefits they were expecting to receive to help pay off that loan.
It's very important, even as we have a farm bill coming together, that this kind of information be out. You'll be posting this online at some point, perhaps?
That's right. These slides will be, for my presentation, will be on the website for the Risk and Profit Conference.
So that's a good place to tap into it. That's at, by the way, agmanager.info. And once more, it's worth a look to see just how those government subsidies that go to crop producers here in Kansas, and elsewhere for that matter, do relate to the arrangements between tenants and landlords, and in fact, who is receiving the benefit from those subsidies. And so, Nathan, good work, as always. Thanks for coming over.
Thanks for having me.
Nathan Hendricks, agricultural economist at Kansas State University, sharing his information gleaned from this analysis at the Risk and Profit Conference here at K-State. Later on today here on the campus. And you're listening to Agriculture Today. More coming your way in a moment on the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today. We're not quite on the doorstep of corn harvest here in Kansas, but will be soon. And so some thoughts are offered up today to you growers on making the most of your harvest through good, efficient harvesting practices. And one of the things you need to understand is just what kind of yield losses you may be incurring through the combine. We'll talk about that now with Gretchen Sassenrath. Gretchen is a research and extension crops and soils agronomist for K-State, and she's based in southeast Kansas. She recently contributed to an Agronomy e-Update article on corn harvest efficiency. This is something that producers understand may well be out there, but whether or not they're doing something to minimize that grain loss is another question, Gretchen.
Right. That's the thing, is that the harvest is a really critical point. We get excited about getting into the field and finally getting the corn out. We also get really focused on watching the weather report and watching the corn dry down, and we want to be sure and get in there at a timely manner. The critical thing, though, is to spend time now calibrating the combine and getting it tightened up so you get the corn that you've grown, that you harvest as much as possible. Now, you can never get 100%. There always is going to be some loss. But some of the losses you can definitely reduce so that you harvest as much of your corn as possible.
And to take that step, you have to know just what's happening, and that is estimating those yield losses. And that's principally why we have you here today to talk about that in a moment. But one of the obvious indicators of grain losses during combining would be volunteer corn growth. And that becomes pretty evident at some point.
Right. And especially in the southern parts of the state, we've got plenty of heat days. After the corn is harvested, we can get a nice stand of volunteer corn. But all of that stand of volunteer corn is just corn that we didn't harvest. And so that's a direct yield loss for us. So we want to harvest as much of the corn as we can and reduce the volunteer corn crop, if you will.
And the volunteer carries its own set of concerns if you let it go. So
right. That's the thing. Some folks, joke about the volunteer corn is our cover crop. Yeah, it might be helping your soil organic matter, but it's representing a yield loss, and it's also potentially introducing diseases or carryover of pests or other problems.
So, right to it, Gretchen, estimating in an accurate way the yield losses as grain would pass through the combine and not make it to the bin. Simple steps, but they need to be carried out.
Right. The easiest thing, there's two places the yield can be lost. One is at the header, and the other is the back end of the combine. What you want to do is harvest a little bit and then back the combine up and then just count how many kernels are in front of the combine. Easy way to do that is to put your feet at perpendicular, which is a bit of a challenge to get that stance, and then count the number of kernels in that little square right around your feet. It'll be approximately 1 square foot. Count the number of kernels that are in that block, if you will. Then divide that by 2, and that represents your bushels per acre yield loss. So if you count 20 kernels in that block, divide it by 2, that's 10. You've got a 10 bushel an acre yield loss. That might not be much if you've got 200 bushels per acre, but if you're harvesting 100 bushels per acre, a 10 bushel yield loss is 10% loss. That's kind of high. So, again, you will never harvest 100%, but you want to get probably 2 or 3% as the potential yield loss. The other thing to watch is coming out the back end of the combine, you might get what's called a windrow effect, where one area right behind the combine has a lot of kernels to it, but the area adjacent doesn't. And then it's windrowing and putting the kernels there. Again, count the area behind the combine and whether the yield losses in front of the combine or behind the combine will tell you what needs to be calibrated or tightened up to improve your harvest efficiency.
Producers do tend to follow the combine, like you say, and check it after the fact, but you want them to do both. That is, look for potential header losses as well as throwover losses.
Yes, that's correct, because you can lose from both ends, and you need to know which end you're losing from to figure out which part to adjust.
And then it's about, well, for one thing, going to the manual and knowing where to adjust. It could be the header, it could be in the threshing process, it could be in the sifting process. It could happen in a lot of places, right. Actually.
The ag engineers have put together a very good description of the process where potential yield losses are coming from and how to count and calibrate the combine for optimal efficiency. And that's the Corn Production Handbook that was published several years ago. Very good, useful information that is available online.
When it comes to reducing these losses, Gretchen, one of the straightforward things that's going to contribute to that would be speed through the field, speed operating the machine within the field. Slower may well be better on both counts, you say.
Yes, actually, the newer combines are great, and they are used to operating at a certain speed, but you need to match the speed to the crop conditions and the field conditions. And although these new combines can go faster, faster is not always better. If you notice you're losing a lot, it might just be as simple as slowing down. So you really need to match the speed of the machine to what the efficiency and how the corn is harvesting. That's an easy way to harvest more and get more in the bin.
And that's back to why it's important to continually, through your harvest, over your acreage, check for losses so you can see if, in fact, you are needing to pare back on that field speed or the machine speed itself, or if you can move forward.
And actually, that's a good point, too, because the crop conditions and the weather conditions will change how the harvest goes. If the corn's a little bit has more moisture in it, or it's a little bit drier, you might get more or less header loss. So you need to find out how that particular field is cutting. Is it doing well, or you got good efficiency, or do you need to modify something to better match the field conditions and the weather conditions during the harvest? The other thing, too, is corn we tend to notice because, again, after our corn harvest, we have a lot of good growing time that this second corn crop or the volunteer corn can come up. But the same thing happens with soybeans and wheat. So all of your systems need to be looked at to improve the harvest efficiency. You spent all that time and money growing it. You want to harvest it. So check it out.
There is a resource that we might bring up that folks can use to get an idea of kernel count with a little more guidance if they need it. It's actually a mobile app. You might talk about that.
Yes, there's 2 mobile apps available. One is for the iPhone and one is for the Android system. And those are available. You can install them and then it'll have you count kernels in a certain area, put that information in, and then give you an estimate of how much yield loss you have.
Look for Ag PhD. That is the guide word, if you will, to the mobile app that you can use. But you want to cap those losses at 1 to 2%, maybe even 3%, but really no more. That's your target.
That's what you want to do. You certainly don't want to leave your crop laying on the ground.
Thanks for coming over and passing along what is a basic message, but an important one nonetheless, Gretchen, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Gretchen Sassenrath with us. She is a research and extension crops and soils agronomist for K-State, and she's based in southeast Kansas. If you'd like to see more guidance on exactly what adjustments to make at the combine level to minimize those harvest losses as you go about your corn picking, go to the E-Update series out of the Department of Agronomy at K-State. In the edition dated July the 27th, you'll see a full write-up on strategies for improving that corn harvest efficiency at agronomy.ksu.edu. And it's an opportune time ahead of the break to let you know about a pair of K-State field days coming up next Tuesday, and corn production is on the slate at each of these. The North Central Kansas Experiment Field Day will start at 6 o'clock Tuesday evening at the Belleville Experiment Field, just west of Belleville along U.S. Highway 36. K-State's Chip Redmond will take a look at Mesonet and the new weather station there at Belleville, the weather and climate information that'll provide producers. Also revisiting summer row crop seeding recommendations for corn, soybeans, and sorghum. Ignacio Ciampiti will cover that. And the agronomist in charge of the North Central Kansas Experiment Field, Andrew Esser, with a look at the dicamba Roundup Ready Sentinel plot and a season review of research there at the field. Of course, a free program, 6 o'clock Tuesday evening, the North Central Kansas Experiment Field Fall Field Day, just outside of Belleville. And far to the west, the K-State Dryland Ag Day, taking place near Tribune. That'll get going Tuesday morning at 8:30 Mountain Time, followed by field tours, indoor seminars, and a sponsored lunch. The field tours including a look at dryland corn planting date and maturity, tillage versus no-till in dryland systems, dryland crop rotations, and weed control in fallow and row crop. The indoor seminars include a look at economics of dryland tillage systems, managing iron chlorosis in grain sorghum production, and production of annual forages. A team of K-State researchers and specialists covering all of that at the K-State Dryland Ag Day planned for the university's research center just west of Tribune along Kansas Highway 96 this coming Tuesday morning, start time 8:30 Mountain Time. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. Now, today's agricultural news headlines in brief for you, courtesy in part of DTN. China's Ministry of Commerce announced late yesterday that the U.S. and China will hold trade talks with a Chinese delegation headed to the U.S. later this month. China's Vice Commerce Minister Wang Shouwen will lead the Chinese team that will meet with U.S. Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs David Malpass. This visit comes at the invitation of the U.S. and is viewed as a session to gauge whether or not higher-level discussions can be held. Some in China are labeling the officials headed to the U.S. as senior officials in the Chinese delegation, while U.S. officials have indicated that talks are lower-level exploratory discussions. Meanwhile, what had been 3 days of hearings next week by the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative on the proposed $200 billion in tariffs on Chinese goods will now cover the full week, according to the agency. Around 370 are scheduled to testify at those sessions. Retail sales of high-horsepower two-wheel drive farm tractors in the U.S. and Canada grew by 30% year-over-year in the month of July, despite forecasts for falling farm income and worries about used equipment inventories. The Association of Equipment Manufacturers reporting that 1,870 high-horsepower models were sold last month, driving up tractor sales since the start of the year by 7% over the same period in 2017. Now, this July sales report should help steady the nerves of Deere investors ahead of that equipment maker's fiscal third quarter results to be released tomorrow. Shares of Deere and other tractor makers are lower as the USDA is predicting net farm income will fall by nearly 7% here in 2018. And the National Oilseed Processors Association says that U.S. soybean processors crushed 167 million bushels of beans in July, according to traders. That's up from the same time a year earlier. More than analysts were anticipating. It was the second highest on record. Strong domestic demand for soybeans to crush into meal has been a bright spot for a market otherwise pressured by trade issues. And that's a good lead-in to this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. Here's Greg Akagi.
Joe Steinkamp, an Indiana soybean producer who serves on the American Soybean Association's Board of Directors and Governing Committee, joins us. And Joe, one of the big awards for ASA are the Conservation and Legacy Awards. And right now, ASA is currently accepting applications for the awards.
Yes, the applications for the Conservation Legacy Awards are going to be accepted, I believe, until September 7th. And you can go to the ASA website to pick up that application. And ASA has been hosting this along with Corn and Soybean Giant Chefs for over 15 years.
And what's the biggest reason why you want to honor soybean producers with the Conservation Legacy Award?
The people that we send 60% of our soybean crop to, that would be all of our customers outside of the United States. They're interested in finding out how we're growing our crops sustainably on our farms. And conservation is a big step in growing our crops with conservation in mind and sustainable, because they want to know that we're going to be able to supply them crops in 2018 and on into 2020 and for 50 and 100 years later, because they're counting on us, so they want us to be doing it sustainably. So the American Soybean Association want to honor the people that have been doing this already and encourage others to do that. So the more ways we get the conservation out to our neighbors through these awards, that way more people will consider doing it. And we want to reward the people who are doing it right now.
Now, something new for this year, there is a new region that's been added to this year's program.
After all these years of being involved in the Conservation Legacy Awards, we finally decided that the people in Minnesota and North Dakota and South Dakota and Wisconsin and those upper states do things differently than Kansas and Missouri and Iowa and Illinois and Indiana. We divided up and redistributed our regions, and that upper Midwest is going to be all those what we consider upper states, and then Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri, more Corn Belt states will be together, because Indiana doesn't do it exactly very similar to Kansas, but it's more similar than some of our friends in northern Wisconsin and North Dakota.
Joe, as you mentioned, the applications must be submitted by September the 7th. What is the best way for the soybean producer to submit their application?
To get online and read the requirements from the American Soybean Association website, and then everything, of course, can be submitted electronically.
That's Joe Steinkamp, an Indiana soybean producer who serves on American Soybean Association's Board of Directors and Governing Committee. He joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi there. As always, many thanks, Greg. And one last reminder for you beef cattle producers that third and final Kansas Livestock Association, Kansas State University Ranch Management Field Day is set for this afternoon in Lynn County, east central Kansas. Loma Land and Cattle, located near Lacine, owned by the Robert Thayer family, will serve as hosts. On the agenda, a panel discussion looking at what makes controlling invasive plants a challenge and providing options to lessen the burden. On that, from the NRCS, Dane Varney, from K-State, Walt Fick, and a local rancher from Parker, Greg Christensen. Also, a look at technology to produce lab-grown meat, which has raised concern in the beef industry about the future of fake meat. From the NCBA, the Director of Government Affairs, Danielle Beck, will talk about the politics of the issue and the battle over which federal agency should regulate fake meat products. And AgReview's Amy Roeder and Steve Vollrath will share timely information about programs available to livestock producers through the USDA Risk Management Agency, including a close look at the Livestock Risk Protection Program, the Livestock Gross Margin Program, and the Rainfall Index Program. From the KLA, Matt Teagarden will provide an overview of the state's new cattle traceability pilot project. The KLA, K-State, and the Kansas Department of Agriculture unveiled that back on June the 30th. Cattle Trace by name. And K-State's Jamie Lynn Farney will round out the program. She'll discuss options for cover crops and summer annual forages for livestock feeding. The field day begins with registration at 3 o'clock this afternoon. It concludes with the free beef dinner at 6:45. All livestock producers and anybody involved in the cattle business certainly invited to attend. The Loma Land and Cattle Company is located south of Lacine. That's in northeastern Lynn County. Directional signs will be posted. Go to kla.org for more specific directions. But again, the third and last KLA, Kansas State University Ranch Management Field Day at the Loma Land and Cattle Company in Lynn County, starting at 3 o'clock with registration this afternoon. We hope you producers can take that excellent program in. We'll return in just a moment with more. You're listening to Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. For you next on Agriculture Today, our weekly K-State Horticulture segment, and for homeowners who are managing cool season lawns, particularly fescue lawns, through this very tough summer. We have some thoughts on carrying that lawn through until the fall and, in fact, renovating it if need be. Jared Hoyle is along with us. He's a research and extension turfgrass specialist here at K-State. It's been difficult, to say the least, on fescue lawns this summer. With the dryness and with the heat, it's just the recipe for extreme stress on those lawns, Jared.
That is correct. We have seen a lot of pockets in Kansas, a lot of drought conditions, and a lot of heat. We had early heat this year in a lot of areas, so the plants were stressed way earlier than they were in the years past. So it has been very hard for tall fescue lawns, even though it's one of the best cool season grasses to grow here in the state of Kansas. So they're probably dying out in a lot of areas if you weren't able to water it or able to maintain it through the summer. And so it's going to be time to do some renovation.
Before we get into those techniques, though, how does one tell whether an existing fescue lawn can be salvaged to any extent?
Well, you can go out and you can just kind of take a look at it. Most of the time I think of it, is it at the quality that you want it to be at? It's going to look a lot more brownish now, a lot drier. But no, those plants, most of them, if they haven't completely died off, they will grow back from the crown. It's not going to be like Bermuda or zoysia where it's going to fill in large areas because it does not have rhizomes or stolons. But tall fescue will bunch out and thicken up once the temperatures cool off.
But if you've spotty damage to that lawn, renovation may well be in order.
That's correct. If it's to a point of no return, then it's time to maybe do a full renovation where you may want to get rid of everything there. But if it's partly there, or if you have some that's still alive, then you can do your overseeding practices and still keep what's existing there and plant new into the areas that may have been weakened or died out.
So is it time to start prepping for that renovation?
It is getting close to that time, yes. Here in August, is a good time to go out. If you had some grubs, maybe escaped from your preventative application, you can go out and treat for grubs right now so it doesn't do any further damage. You can start thinking about your weed control to get rid of what weeds are there before overseeding, whether it be some crabgrass or whether it be some broadleaf weeds. And whatever application you're doing, make sure you check the label and look at the reseeding interval. Most of them will tell you do not reseed for 2 to 3 weeks after application. So if you go ahead and start getting rid of them now, when the temperatures turn cooler in September, hopefully they turn cooler in September, then you'll have those weeds out of the way and you can start your renovation process or overseeding process.
So pest control is what it's about for the here and now, but one doesn't want to start actually tearing up soil at this point yet, do they?
Not yet. We're getting close. So what you'd want to do, in the September time frame is usually when you're looking at the fertilizing. So that's the best time of year to go in and do your seeding. You kind of go in and mow your lawn down a little bit after you've got your weeds and stuff out of it. And then you'd come in and aerify with an aerator, go a couple times over the lawn to get some good holes in the ground to help the seed go in those holes as well. If it's too far gone, or if you really want to do a total renovation, you can mow it down and use what's called a verticutter or slicer, and that really tears up everything, that soil surface, and then you rake that debris off and then seed into it. But that's going to be a very aggressive process where the aerating is not going to be as aggressive. So if you have a pretty decent lawn and you just want to thicken it up, maybe fill in some smaller areas, I'd recommend going with the aerifier instead of that verticutter.
But if it's a full makeover, the verticutter would be the option of choice.
Yes, and there is a verticutter, slicers, some people call them, and then there are cedar slicers that has a seed box on it as well. Those are not as aggressive as a typical verticutter. So you can go over your lawn with those and it will drop the seed in as well. But if you're to verticut or aerify, then you would, once you do that and you get the debris off, then you come in and you would overseed with your tall fescue with a broadcast spreader's always the best because you get a good dispersion of it. You're going to be looking at 8 pounds per 1,000 square feet for overseeding your tall fescue. Then that's a good time to put your fertilizer down as well. Between September, October, and November, you want maximum of 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, or 3 pounds, 1 pound at a time. So September, you can put 1 pound on. October, you can do 1 pound. November, you could do 1 pound. Or you could come in with 3 pounds of a slow release in September, and then that's going to help you get through the rest of the year if that slow release releases through the next 3 months.
But how early to actually start seeding? That's a judgment call most years, but early September is fair game?
Yes, and I struggle with this myself every year. Is it too early? Is it not early enough? Is it too late? And so sometimes it's a roll of a dice. It's whenever, do I have time this weekend? Am I in town able to do it? I know it's going to be a little bit warmer, so I may have to, water it a little bit more until it cools off. Or towards the end, if you're a little later, then you're going to be later and you may know you might not have as good or healthy a stand of establishment prior to wintertime. I like to err a little bit more on the earlier side than the later side just because there's less room for error. And you can help put more water down onto it and get it going comparatively to the latter, where if you run out of fall temperatures, you run out of it, there's nothing we can really do with it.
And have to ask you, do we see any major differences in fescue cultivars in terms of drought tolerance?
Yes, there is. K-State does research here at the Manhattan Rocky Ford Research Station, as well as in the Olathe Horticulture Research Center and down at the J.C. Pear Wichita Center. We plant different single varieties of fescue and then evaluate them over the year to see how well they do. We do have some recommended varieties, so you can get on the KSU Turf website or the KSRE bookstore and look at recommended turf varieties for tall fescue. Just print that page off and take it with you to the store and cross-reference it. But those newer varieties, they're called turf-type tall fescues, work really, really well, and they do have the increased disease, drought, pest tolerances, where the old standard K31 is the standard variety, and it just doesn't do as well. It's a thicker leaf blade, a yellower color. It's just not as an attractive lawn.
Well, Jared, we're wishing our homeowners well as they make decisions on what to do about those fescue lawns that have been put through the paces in a very rough way this summer. Appreciate your time as always.
Thank you for the invitation.
He is Jared Hoyle, turfgrass specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And that is this week's K-State Horticulture segment, closing out our Thursday edition. Once again, thanks for being along with us. Please rejoin us tomorrow, won't you? Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.